I walked into my courtroom that Thursday morning and saw two brothers sitting as far apart as the ruin would allow. James was on the plaintiff's side, 52 years old, wearing a suit that had seen better days. And his younger brother David sat at the defendant's table, 47, designer clothes, expensive watch, looking completely unbothered by the fact that his brother was suing him. James was suing David for $28,000, money that had been saved specifically for their father's funeral, money that their father had set aside over the last 10 years of his life, money that David had accessed and spent while their father was dying in hospice, money that was supposed to bury a man with dignity. Their father, Harold, had died 6 weeks earlier, lung cancer. He'd known it was coming for months, and Harold had been very deliberate about his end-of-life planning. He'd saved money specifically for his funeral. He'd told both sons exactly where the money was. A savings account at a local credit union, $28,000, enough for a proper funeral, burial plot, headstone. Everything handled so his sons wouldn't have to scramble. Harold had added both James and David to the account. Joint ownership. His reasoning was that if he died suddenly, either son could access the funds immediately to pay funeral expenses. No waiting for probate, no bureaucratic delays, just quick access to money when it was needed most. Harold had been very clear about the purpose of that account. James testified that their father had talked about it frequently in his final months, had told both sons the money was only for funeral expenses, not for anything else, not ever. That money had one purpose, and Harold had trusted his sons to honor it. Harold died on a Tuesday morning. James was with him. David was supposed to be there, but hadn't shown up. James had called David multiple times that morning, saying their father was close to the end. David had said he was coming. He never arrived. Harold died with only James holding his hand. After his father died, James had called the funeral home they discussed, made the initial arrangements. The funeral director had asked about payment. James had said there was a dedicated account. He'd go to the credit union that afternoon and arrange a direct payment to the funeral home. James went to the credit union 3 hours after his father died, still in shock, still grieving. He'd asked to speak to someone about accessing the funeral account. The bank manager had pulled up the account, looked at James with an expression he couldn't read, and told him the account had been emptied 2 days earlier, all $28,000, withdrawn by David. James said he'd stood there not comprehending what he was hearing. There must be a mistake. That money was for their father's funeral. David wouldn't have taken it. The bank manager showed him the withdrawal slip, David's signature, dated 2 days before Harold died. The account balance was $14.37. James had called David immediately, asked what happened to the funeral money. David had said he'd needed it, that he'd had an emergency, that he planned to put it back before their father died. James had asked what kind of emergency required $28,000. David had said it was personal. Then he'd hung up. James had no money to pay for the funeral. Harold had lived modestly. His estate consisted of the small house he'd owned and maybe $10,000 in a checking account. But that was tied up in probate, couldn't be accessed immediately. The funeral home needed payment up front or within days. James had scrambled. He'd put $5,000 on a credit card, borrowed $3,000 from his own savings, asked his wife to borrow money from her parents, taken out a personal loan for the rest. He'd pieced together enough to give their father a basic funeral. Nothing elaborate. Simple casket, small service, cremation instead of the burial plot Harold had wanted. It was the best James could do on short notice with borrowed money. At the funeral, David had shown up late. He'd sat in the back. He'd left early. He hadn't offered to help pay for anything. James had been too shocked and grief-stricken to confront him there, But afterward, James had demanded answers. David had finally admitted what he'd spent the money on. Gambling debts. He'd gotten in deep with online poker, owed money to people he described as serious. He'd needed $28,000 to clear his debts. He'd known about the funeral account. He'd known his father was dying, and he'd taken the money anyway. David had promised to pay it back, said he'd have the money within a month. James had wanted to believe him, had wanted to think his brother wouldn't actually steal their dying father's funeral fund. But a month passed, then two. David made excuses, said he was waiting on a bonus, said he was getting a loan, said he'd have it soon. He never paid back a penny. And when James threatened to sue, David had said, "Go ahead." Said the account had both their names on it. Said he'd had legal right to withdraw that money. Said James couldn't prove it was only meant for the funeral. But James could prove it. He'd brought their father's handwritten notes. Harold had kept meticulous records, notes stating the purpose of the account, dated entries showing deposits over the years, a letter Harold had written to both sons 3 months before he died, specifically stating the money was for funeral expenses only. James's attorney entered all of it into evidence. Harold's handwriting, his clear instructions, his explicit purpose for the account. There was no ambiguity. That money had one designated use, and David had stolen it. David's attorney tried to argue that a joint account meant joint ownership, that David had legal right to withdraw funds, that there was no written contract restricting his access. He painted this as a simple disagreement about shared property, but I wasn't buying it. Just because you have legal access to an account doesn't mean you have the right to use it for any purpose. Harold had been clear. That money was held in trust for a specific purpose. David had violated that trust. Then James's attorney brought in something damning. David's bank records from the 2 days after he withdrew the funeral money. The $28,000 had been deposited into David's personal checking account. Then immediately, systematic transfers. $15,000 to an online gambling site, $8,000 to another gambling platform, $3,000 cash withdrawal, $2,000 to pay off a credit card. David hadn't paid off serious gambling debts to dangerous people. He'd paid off debts to online casinos, and then he'd immediately started gambling again. The bank records showed thousands more in gambling transactions in the weeks after. David hadn't borrowed the funeral money to get out of trouble. He'd stolen it to keep gambling. I asked David directly if this was true. He said gambling was an addiction. He couldn't control it. He needed help. I asked why he hadn't sought treatment instead of stealing from his dying father. David said he'd been desperate. I asked David if he understood that while he was gambling with the funeral money, his father was dying in hospice. David said yes, but he hadn't been thinking clearly. I asked if he'd visited his father in those final days. David admitted he hadn't. He'd been too focused on his gambling. James broke down on the stand. He said their father had asked for David in his final hours, had wanted both his sons there when he died. Harold had kept asking where David was, kept asking if someone had called him. James had kept saying David was coming, but David never came because David was at home gambling away the funeral money. Harold died asking for a son who couldn't be bothered to show up because he was too busy spending his father's funeral fund on online poker. James said the cruelty of that was unbearable. Their father's final hours worrying about David, wanting to see him, and David was sitting at home putting that money on virtual card games. James said he'd never forgive David for that, not for stealing the money, for stealing their father's final chance to see both his sons. The funeral had been terrible. James had been forced to cut corners everywhere. Cheaper casket, shorter viewing time, no burial plot, which Harold had specifically wanted. James said every compromise had felt like another betrayal of his father. Every corner cut because David had gambled the money away. James's attorney asked about the $14.37 left in the account. David's attorney objected to the question. but I allowed it. James testified that he'd withdrawn that money too, used it to buy flowers for the funeral. It was all that was left of Harold's careful savings, $14 that bought a single, modest arrangement. David's attorney tried to generate sympathy. He brought in a counselor who testified that David had a gambling addiction. That addiction is a disease, that David needed treatment, not punishment. The counselor said David was in recovery now, that he'd learned from his mistakes. I asked the counselor when David had started treatment. She said 2 weeks ago. I asked why David had waited 6 weeks after his father's death to seek help. She said David had needed to hit rock bottom. I asked if stealing his dying father's funeral money counted as rock bottom. She didn't have a good answer. Then James's attorney entered David's social media posts. Photos from the 3 weeks after Harold died. David at expensive restaurants. David showing off new clothes. David at a casino in Atlantic City. All posted while James was working extra hours to pay off the loans he'd taken for the funeral. David had stolen the funeral money, gambled most of it away, spent the rest on himself, and then gone to Atlantic City to gamble more, while his brother buried their father with borrowed money. I've seen a lot of terrible family betrayals in my courtroom, but something about this one struck me as particularly vicious. Harold had planned for his own death, had saved carefully, had tried to make it easy for his sons, and one of those sons had seen his dying father's funeral money as an opportunity to fund his gambling addiction. David's attorney made one last argument. He said that even if David had misused the money, James had benefited from the account being joint, that James had access to, that they both owned the funds equally, that at most, David owed James half. But that was ridiculous. The account wasn't meant to be split between them. It was meant to bury their father. Both sons had equal access, so either could handle the funeral quickly, not so they could split it like an inheritance. I asked David if he put any money toward his father's funeral. He admitted he hadn't. I asked if he'd offered to help James with the loans James had taken. He said no. I asked if he'd shown any remorse beyond claiming he had an addiction. David said he felt terrible, but the addiction had controlled him. I didn't believe him. Addiction might explain the gambling. It didn't explain the complete absence of remorse. It didn't explain refusing to help with funeral costs. It didn't explain partying and posting on social media while James struggled with debt. I ruled in James's favor. David owed the full $28,000 that had been in the account, plus interest, plus reimbursement for the loans James had taken, plus damages for emotional distress. Total judgment, $43,000. David's attorney objected immediately, said his client was in financial trouble, couldn't pay. I told him David should have thought about that before stealing his father's funeral money. I ordered wage garnishment at the maximum legal percentage until the debt was satisfied. I also did something I don't often do. I lectured David from the bench. I told him his father had trusted him, had added him to that account believing David would honor its purpose. Harold had died asking for David, had spent his final hours wanting to see a son who was too busy gambling to visit. I told David that he'd stolen more than money. He'd stolen his father's dignity in death. He'd forced Harold to have a cheap funeral when Harold had saved for years to avoid that. He'd made his brother go into debt while he gambled and partied. And he'd shown no genuine remorse for any of it. I said that addiction might explain the initial theft. It didn't explain everything after. The continued gambling, the expensive meals, the casino trip, the complete disregard for his brother's suffering. Those were choices, conscious decisions. David had chosen himself over his father's memory and his brother's well-being at every turn. David sat there expressionless. I don't think anything I said reached him. People deep in addiction often can't see beyond their own needs, can't grasp the harm they cause. David had destroyed his relationship with his brother and dishonored his father's memory, and I'm not sure he fully understood why that mattered. James told me later that David never paid a cent of the judgment. David quit his job to avoid wage garnishment, started working cash jobs that couldn't be tracked. James hired a collections attorney, but they couldn't find any assets to seize. David had nothing worth taking because he'd gambled everything away. The $43,000 judgment sits unpaid, will probably remain unpaid forever. But James had wanted it on record, wanted documentation that what David did was wrong, that David owed this debt even if he never paid it. James refinanced his house to pay off the funeral loans, took on 15 years of additional mortgage payments because of what David stole. James said every payment reminds him of his brother's betrayal. Every statement that arrives reminds him that David chose gambling over their father. The brothers haven't spoken since the trial. James told me he has no brother anymore, that David died to him the day he learned about the stolen funeral money, that some betrayals sever relationships permanently. David's gambling apparently continued. James heard through mutual acquaintances that David had gotten in deeper, lost more money, was being pursued by creditors. James felt nothing hearing that, said David had made his choices and could live with the consequences. Harold was cremated. His ashes sit in an urn in James's home because James still hasn't been able to afford the burial plot and headstone Harold wanted. James is saving again, trying to eventually give his father the burial he'd planned. But it's slow. James has his own family to support, the extra mortgage payments. Every year, on the anniversary of Harold's death, James visits the funeral home where the service was held, sits in the chapel, remembers his father, and feels the absence of everything Harold should have had. The burial plot, the headstone with his name, the dignified funeral he'd saved for. David took all of that, gambled it away on virtual cards and online slots, converted years of Harold's careful savings into nothing, into losses on a computer screen, into money that vanished as quickly as David could bet it. I think about Harold sometimes, about working and saving for years to make sure your death wouldn't burden your children, about explicitly setting aside money for one purpose, about trusting your sons to honor your wishes, and one of those sons stealing it while you lay dying. Harold never knew what David did. That's probably a mercy. He died believing his affairs were in order, believing his sons would have access to the funeral money, believing he'd made it easy for them. He didn't know that one son had already emptied the account and was gambling it away while the other son held his hand in hospice. James carries that knowledge alone now, knows his father died with false peace of mind, knows David betrayed him at the worst possible moment, knows their father asked for David in his final hours, and David couldn't be bothered because he was too busy spending the funeral money. That's what gambling addiction combined with selfishness does. It makes you capable of unconscionable acts. It makes you steal from the dying. It makes you prioritize the next bet over your father's final hours. It destroys everything it touches. David destroyed his relationship with James, destroyed his father's final wishes, destroyed any chance of being part of his family going forward. All for $28,000 that he lost gambling within days. James works extra shifts now, saves what he can, hopes to eventually buy that burial plot and headstone, give his father what he deserves, even if it's years late. It's become James's mission, his way of honoring Harold when David wouldn't. The $14.37 James used for flowers was the only part of Harold's funeral money that actually went to the funeral. $14 out of $28,000. The rest became poker hands and slot spins and losses on a screen. David's addiction counselor had said he'd hit rock bottom, but I wonder if that's true. Rock bottom should involve recognition of harm caused, genuine remorse, commitment to making amends. David showed none of that. He showed up to court, lost the case, and walked away unchanged. Maybe rock bottom is still coming for David. Maybe one day he'll understand what he did. Understand that he stole his dying father's funeral money and forced his brother into debt. Understand that his addiction became an excuse for cruelty. But probably not. Addicts who sunk that low often just keep sinking, keep gambling, keep losing, keep blaming everyone but themselves. David is probably still gambling right now, still losing, still refusing to take responsibility for the destruction he's caused. James has built a life without David in it, has raised his kids to know they had a grandfather who deserved better, has told them about Harold's character and kindness, has made sure Harold is remembered, even though David stole the funeral that should have honored him. That's all James can do. Remember, honor, save for the burial plot his father wanted, work to eventually right the wrong David committed. It's inadequate. It's not the same as Harold getting what he planned, but it's something. The gambling sites kept David's money, all $28,000. They didn't care it was stolen from a dying man's funeral fund. They just took the bets and kept the losses. They're designed that way, to take everything people are willing to give. They don't ask where the money came from or whether it should be gambled. David gave them his father's funeral money, and they took it gladly. And Harold got cremated in a cheap service because his son couldn't stop gambling long enough to be there when he died. That's the truth of this case. Simple and terrible. A father saved for his own funeral. A son stole it for gambling. Another son went into debt to bury him anyway. I gave James a judgment he'll probably never collect. But I also gave him validation, official recognition that David was wrong, that what he did was theft, that James was the victim. Sometimes that's all the law can offer. Validation without restitution. Justice on paper that doesn't translate to actual recovery. James took it, said it mattered to have the court say David was wrong, that Harold's intentions were clear, that the money should have gone to the funeral. It didn't fix anything, but it meant something. David left court that day and probably went straight to another gambling site, probably made more bets he couldn't afford, probably lost more money he didn't have. The judgment didn't change him. The shame of what he'd done didn't reach him. He just moved on to the next bet. And James went home to his family and the urn containing his father's ashes, and the knowledge that his brother had betrayed them both in the worst possible way. That's what he got from all this. Not his money back, not his brother back, just the permanent weight of knowing what David did. Harold deserved sons who would honor his memory, who would use the money he saved for its intended purpose, who would give him the burial he wanted. He got James, who tried despite everything, and David, who stole and gambled and destroyed. One good son wasn't enough to prevent the harm the bad son caused. That's the tragedy. James did everything right, and it still wasn't enough because David did everything wrong. The funeral fund that was supposed to make everything easy made everything worse. Created opportunity for theft, created conflict between brothers, created debt and betrayal and permanent family rupture. Harold's careful planning became the instrument of family destruction because one son couldn't resist stealing it. If Harold had known what would happen, he probably would have prepaid the funeral home directly, removed the money from David's reach, protected his own final wishes from his son's addiction. But he trusted both his boys, and that trust was betrayed. James lives with that now, lives with knowing his father's trust was misplaced, lives with the debt and the simple funeral and the ashes waiting for a burial that keeps getting delayed, lives with having no brother because that brother chose gambling over family. David lives with whatever consequences his continued gambling creates. More debt, more losses, more burned relationships, more choices he'll justify with addiction while refusing to actually address it, more destruction in his wake. And somewhere, $28,000 that should have buried a good man with dignity became data points in a casino's profit margin, became numbers on a spreadsheet, became nothing at all except the absence it created in Harold's funeral and James's life. That's what this case was really about. Not the legal question of account ownership, the human cost of addiction and betrayal, the permanent damage one person's choices created, the father who deserved better, and the son who made sure he didn't get it. I ruled correctly. James deserved that judgment. But no judgment can undo what David did. Can't restore the funeral money. Can't give Harold the burial he wanted. Can't heal the relationship between brothers. All I could do was say David was wrong and owed this debt. It's not enough. It's never enough. But it's what the law allows. And sometimes that's all anyone gets. Official recognition of wrong without actual remedy. Justice that exists on paper, but nowhere else. James understood that, accepted it, moved forward carrying everything David had left him carrying. That's all he could do. All any of us can do when family betrays us beyond repair. David got his judgment. James got his validation. Harold got a funeral that wasn't what he deserved. And the family splintered into pieces that will never fit back together. That's what $28,000 in gambling losses bought. That's what David's addiction cost. That's what happens when someone steals from the dying and feels no remorse. Everyone lost except the gambling sites. They won. They always do. They got the money and gave nothing back except the temporary illusion that the next bet might work out. It never does. David learned that. Or maybe he didn't. Maybe he's still chasing that win, still gambling, still losing, still destroying everything around him one bet at a time. And James is still saving for that burial plot, still trying to honor his father years after the funeral that should have done it properly, still carrying the weight of being the good son in a family where being good wasn't enough to prevent the harm the bad son caused. That's the real ending of this case. Not my ruling, the permanent aftermath, the ongoing consequences, the family that will never recover from what David did in those final days of their father's life. Harold deserved better. James deserved better. And David deserves to carry the weight of what he did forever. Whether he ever will is another question entirely.